call the meeting to order. It's 3:37 p.m. We are meeting here as the Fall River Task Force, and we are in the City Council first floor hearing room. Today is Thursday, June 13th. And pursuant to the open meeting law, any person may make an audio or video recording of this public meeting or may transmit the meeting through any medium. Attendees are therefore advised that such recordings or transmissions are being made, whether perceived or unperceived, by those present and are deemed acknowledged and permissible. This is a rescheduled meeting, and I want to first of all apologize for previous meetings that had to be rescheduled, one of which was absolutely my fault because I missed the 48-hour deadline thinking it was a 5 p.m. deadline, but since we meet at 3:30, it was a 3:30 p.m. deadline, so it wasn't going to be posted within the 48-hour notice. And also I want to acknowledge that Kevin Aguiar had originally rescheduled a dental appointment in order to be here, and then an emergency school committee meeting was called, so he had to attend the emergency school committee meeting, which is being held at exactly this time. Mrs. Viveros is upstairs attending a disability commission meeting, but she's set to proceed and that she'll join us as soon as possible upon completion of, or at least whenever she can get out of the disability meeting that is upstairs. We are going to try to keep to a 4:30 deadline to close because of other commitments. And I also want to just extend your indulgence in how much information I've sent to you, some of which I think I sent to you about 20 minutes ago. There have been lots of pre-meetings in order for us to get to this meeting. I'm feeling a need to try to get this thing moved forward. I know that we all have an interest in seeing our work completed. So I'd like to move us in that direction, and hopefully today we can take a step forward toward that end. So with that, I'll ask the roll call to be called.
Kevin Aguiar, Judith Conrad here. Carl Hetzler.
Yep.
Mike Quinn.
Yep.
Gloria Sadler.
Here.
Kathy Viveros. Chairman Camara.
Here. We call for citizen input. None present, so we can move forward to the next item. The discussion concerning the charter amendment draft prepared by me, and actually that was intended to be prepared by me in conjunction with Corporation Counsel and City Clerk. I would ask that we take out of order the communication from the Corporation Counsel, which is dated June 12th. So hopefully you've all had a chance to review that. If not, I'll give you a couple of minutes to take a look at that. This is the June 12th communication.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
on the document that we received dated June 12th, can you clarify option 2 where he speaks about how the charter could be revised? It says among the choices available, the most restrictive but also the easiest to accomplish is to revise or amend the charter. I'm not sure it gives us the steps required to do that.
Well, as I read it and as I understand it, and he does do it by way of example, if in process of amending the charter, it was decided that amendment might be to eliminate the recall provision, then we could move to amend the recall petition. And in fact, one of the items that is on your agenda is item number 6. On March 19th, the City Council did vote to, and I'd ask us, since we were talking about that, to take a look at item number 6. And the bottom line of it is, be it further resolved that the Fall River Task Force to report its findings and its recommendations to the City Council for its review and action. This is specifically, in the previous, be it resolved that the Council directs the task force to expand its scope by examining the recall process to determine if there's a better way to address the citizens' right to remove an office holder from public office while at the same time assuring the rights of both the elected office holder as well as the rights of citizens of Fall River. So in his letter, Mr. Macy is suggesting that that would be an amendment, just changing in some way the recall provision. He did not preclude our proceeding with, now jump to item 3, for a more far-ranging proposal, or those which suggest some sort of city manager form of government. That was our original dictate from the council. So that's what we've been primarily focusing on, is the city manager. I don't know if I answered your question at all that I've said. Did I come close?
Close, but I'm still, it's all right. I still, depending on what this group decides is going to happen, it may not even be an issue.
Some of which we're really going to proceed with rather quickly, but at this point, there is no charter amendment draft prepared by myself in conjunction with Corporation Counsel and City Clerk. Because of the budgetary hearings that are currently occurring and other demands on the Corporation Council in particular, we were only able to meet on this item yesterday. So he did draft this letter. He had to go off for a doctor's appointment today, so that's why he's not here. But he did indicate to me that if this task force so moves to give him further direction, he's very happy to assist us. He also was very cautious about not wanting to impose too much upon us, that he wants us to make the determination as to what we want to do, and that he wants to assist us should we ask. And in the final item that you received, which is a letter today, I think this is a suggestion of where we might go to move this thing forward. But let's get back to on track. So I would ask us then, considering that there was no charter amendment draft other than the letter from the letter which addresses that we dispense with any further discussion on item number 4, and then we move to item number 5. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, item number 5 is a letter that I had initially drafted in my first, and I must say that I had a brief conversation with Mr. Hetzler, and I spent a lot of time thinking about things and preparing things, and I almost feel that I should suggest that we give item number 5 leave to withdraw, because I have dramatically changed where I think we should go, and I'll speak specifically to some of the items in the June 10th letter. I do agree with the first bullet, for the sake of those who might be watching. The first bullet on the letter, and of course this agenda is available to the public on the city's website, but it was suggesting that we use the Cambridge Charter as the foundation. Okay, the second item on the second bullet does specify an interest in the mayor in establishing a position of deputy mayor, which would be elected by the people. I specifically point this out as being different than Cambridge. Cambridge elects its mayor and deputy mayor as 2 of 9 from the council, and the council elects that leadership. I think, from my experience in government, is that the people of Fall River want to elect their own mayor. Even if that mayor's position is now changed or would be changed by their becoming the chair of the city council in addition to being chair of the school committee. So that was the motivation for suggesting that this might be a good way to go. I went on to consider in item 3 something that we've talked about, is to elect councilors by either wards or by sections. And that was a consideration when I initially wrote this letter. And I was looking at a 7-member council possibility with 5 councilors coming each from north, south, east, west, and central. I still like that idea, but I think that it would be less than probable that an existing council that is elected at large would be amenable to a home rule petition that would change their election process. Mrs. Viveras has joined us, and we're pass this on to her. And we're discussing item number 5, which I'm suggesting being given leave to withdraw because some of the items here are items that I've since thought, well, we ought to just scratch
I think
at
we
this
didn't
point.
get a letter dated June 10th, did we? We just got a
Yes,
letter
this is
dated
it right here,
June
June 10th.
13th.
Item number 5 on your agenda.
Oh,
We're on item number 5, Mrs.
Okay.
Viveras.
Motion to give item number 5, letter dated June 10, 2019, leave to withdraw.
Okay, I encourage that. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, so item number 5, leave to withdraw. And as I said, that the newest letter will address some of the same items that are in that item. So next is item number 6, which is a discussion of the City Council resolution adopted on March 19th. And this gives us another mandate from the council, and let me just go over that a little bit. As a result of the most recent recall and some reactions to it from the community, I thought that maybe we ought to be taking a look at that recall provision. And so I submitted a resolution to the council, which was adopted by the council, which gives us the option to consider a focus on the recall provision. In the letter that I sent to you June 13th, I in fact am suggesting that we slightly amend the recall provision, and I can go into the details of it, but I think I'll wait until we go over the letter of June 13th. But you do have a copy of the resolution that was adopted. Does anyone want me to read it, or everyone's had a chance to review it and read it? Okay, I'll give you a few minutes just to review it if you'd like. Is there any questions or any points anyone would like to raise on this item number 6? Would entertain those. Yes, Mr. Hensel?
All right, as a citizen that lived through the recall process, I don't know that eliminating the recall process is necessarily the right thing to do. I think fixing it is probably the right thing to do. The frustration that I think I heard from people, and I know that I had myself, was that the sitting mayor who was being recalled, and let's face it, 10 years from now, we could have a mayor that does something so outrageous that the people of Fall River want him out or her out. That process has a series of steps that need to take place, and it's good to know that that could happen. What was the most frustrating thing for me was that the person who was sitting in the position of mayor now could be recalled at the top and then re-elected at the bottom. That, to me, is what left Fall River in a cloud of controversy. Not the fact that the people of Fall River came out to vote on a proposal to recall the current mayor. Once the news got out that the current mayor was recalled at the top and then re-elected at the bottom, I think the whole city said, what a waste of time, this was stupid. So I look at the recall, if the city council wants to do something with the recall portion of the charter, I think it needs fixing. I don't think it needs eliminating. That's my own opinion.
Any further comment on this?
I agree with Mr. Hetzler myself. I mean, going through the charter review process, I thought it was fairly clear, and again, it's subject to interpretation, that if you lost the recall portion, you're not allowed to succeed yourself and win on the bottom of the ballot. But up to interpretation, it was ruled against that, and I would say fixing it, making that one line, if you want to do that, where if you lose the recall, if you're recalled, you can't win the election. And I mean, it'll probably be challenged in court in some way, shape, or form, but it's something that could definitely hold up. And I agree with it in that aspect. But again, I think, and this June 13th letter,
Okay, we're not quite there yet.
okay then,
But
that's
as it relates to the resolution,
I yield,
on the resolution. Any further comments on the resolution? Yes, Ms. Sadler?
I think the controversy does require amending, fixed, to quote you, Mr. Hexler. But I also think that the current charter was not completely followed. There were 3 means for removing or requesting a recall. Being charged with a crime, not convicted of a crime. There were many of residents that I interacted with who thought, why were we even going through a recall because someone was not happy, or a group of individuals were not happy that the current sitting mayor was charged with a crime. That was not one of the criterias for recall. So again, Mr. Heckler, I concur, we need to fix, amend, repair, but just permitting individual groups to request a recall, that definitely requires fixing.
Okay.
Just one more thing on that.
Yes,
I agree with you, and one big thing about writing the charter was we had to make a foundation document for the city. And as Ms. Viveros knows, it took a lot of work, and you can't make drastic changes on the initial bedrock document, or else it just wouldn't have passed in general. And granted, there are things in different areas that definitely need to be tweaked and fixed. It's essentially a living document. It's not set in stone. It can be, as Mr. Macy said, amended and repaired. But for the recall aspect, in charged and convicted with a crime, conviction ultimately disqualifies you from office under the current charter. So you have to resign immediately. I think we did up the amount of signatures that you needed in order to, and percentage of the voters needed to get a recall in place. That was something that I was worried about, was that people, city councilors, school committee members, mayors could get recalled off a whim, and I wanted to make it a little harder and have people to definitely narrow their vision if they wanted to get that done. But I think, again, it only needs to be tweaked if you want to really do the recall process. I mean, it is a lot of work, but every citizen's entitled, and in this aspect, I mean, it's a huge integrity factor. If the sitting mayor is charged under the city, I think, and is representing the city on a day-to-day basis, I think they have every right to exercise a right to a recall, just as if it was a city councilor or a school committee member. But with that, I yield.
Any further comments from the members? I do have one. I'd like to offer a couple of points. One of which is just on the conviction issue. In fact, even if one were convicted of a crime, that would probably be challenged because the state law requires conviction and sentencing. So conceivably, someone who is under the charter convicted, by the charter, that person would have to be removed from office. But that person could say, I believe state law prevails, and they could go to court and let a judge decide whether the state law, which says conviction and sentencing, need to be stated rather than just conviction. As it relates to, we actually have some interesting history with recall, because we did have a mayor who was recalled and defeated, replaced. That was with the Flanagan recall. He ended up placing third, and it was his going to court that the judge ruled that, every citizen has the right to pull nomination papers and run for office. So that's why you end up with a recalled person also being a candidate on the second half of the ballot, which, as I understand it, has also been ruled on by the Superior Court. So you end up with a situation in which you can, in fact, be recalled, and yet you can fill the remaining term of the office. The other thing about the recall process, and I appreciate very much, and in fact in my communication, which we're going to get to next, I do believe that we need to keep the recall provision in there because I think the people want to have that. I think the people want to have a recall provision. I think the people want to elect a mayor. I don't think they want to leave that to the council to elect a mayor. So for those reasons, I'm going to be suggesting, and when we get to the next item, you'll see that I keep the recall provision in. But I do have a question for Mr. Quinn as a member of the previous Charter Commission. You had mentioned that the numbers were increased. What numbers were increased? Was it less than 5%? That it got to 5%? Because I thought 5% was what it used to be. 5% is what it is.
I'd have to check my notes on it. It was for the recall, there was essentially no recall provision, and all we had to do was to go off of what it took to get Mayor Flanagan recalled, and that was essentially the statute that we worked with, what the Collins Center worked with, and what the state told us to really work with. So I think it was, how many signatures is it now that you needed?
It's 5% of the voters in the previous election.
Yeah, it was, I think it was something similar to that, or lower. I can't quite remember
Okay,
on that.
that's fine.
I know it was,
It's not absolutely necessary for our discussion, but in response to the point that was made earlier by Mr. Hetzler, the recall itself, and I've been one who has taken this position, the recall itself undoes, if that's the right word, it nullifies the decision of a larger number of voters at a regular city election. So I believe there's almost a illegitimacy to the recall, even though I consider it something that ought to remain in the charter. But I do believe an argument can be made is, what about the 60% of the voters? For instance, I believe in this current situation, the incumbent mayor received over 60% of the vote at a regular city election, where a much larger percentage of voters participated, and the loser of that election received half that number. So the incumbent received almost 2/3 of the votes, and then yet 10 people signing a petition collecting 5% of the signatures can then have a recall where maybe 20 or 30% of the people vote, and it's a proportional representation vote where a percentage less than 50% end up getting elected. So is that a good democratic, small d democratic process where such a small number of people can initiate and institute the removal of someone from office who was elected by 2/3 of the people at a regular city election? So then does a recall election almost become government by the mob, as I used to learn in my Government 101 class, where you end up with a minority of people, a very small minority of people, that's dictating the leadership through a voting process that is initiated by 10 people, and then by 5% of the voting population, and then a recall process where, in the case of 5 people running, conceivably one could be elected with 21% of the vote, or approximate. So you end up with 21% of a minority number of voters who got on the ballot through 5% of the voters. So I think it's an interesting intellectual conversation about philosophy, but recall, and even though I'm speaking strongly against recall, and by the way, Cambridge does not have a recall provision as best as I can determine, and a lot of communities in Massachusetts don't have a recall provision, and with a 2-year term of office, there's argument made also that we have enough elections without having to throw into the mix recall elections. And I think recall elections are very divisive in and of themselves. I just wonder about all of those issues as I think about recalls. Mr. Hetzler.
Okay, so we could bring this right back to elections in general, because a mayor could be elected with 51% of the people who came out to vote, which might only be 18% of the total registered voters in the community. So when you come right down to it, the person that was put in power was put in power by a very small minority of the actual voters within the community. But the argument back to that is, well, if the voters that are registered or could be registered don't wish to vote, what are you gonna do? So you go with the democratic process, and whoever shows up to vote, the majority, whoever gets the majority of that vote wins. In the recall, the same argument could be made that, well, it's not fair that a mayor who was elected by, 5,000 votes is getting bounced out by 3,000 votes. Well, it's publicized that there's a recall election. There were signatures gathered to initiate a recall election. And I would argue that if the mayor who's being recalled is doing a good job and is liked by the people, that it won't even make it through the first process of getting, 4,000 signatures? 4,000 signatures is no small task for anybody to go out and stand in front of storefronts and gather 4,000 signatures. If you have a mayor who's doing their job and is popular because of the effectiveness of the job he's doing, I don't even think it gets by the first process. But if it does, shame on the voters that don't come out to vote to support the incumbent mayor who's being recalled by a small minority, whatever you want to call that group. Shame on the voters for not coming out and supporting the person who has been doing a good job. So, again, it's a difficult situation, but this is democracy. This is what we live in. It's not our role to say, well, it's not fair because only 3,000 voters came out. This happens at town meetings across this country all the time. There are items on the docket to be voted on. 50 people show up to town meeting and vote for something that's going to affect the whole town. And it could be 10,000 people that live in that town. But on that particular night, a small minority showed up and it got passed. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. Mrs. Viveras?
So just to weigh in on this particular conversation without getting into too much history on this, perhaps had the recall provided for a preliminary and a final, all of that would have been resolved, because you would have effectively had another general election. The mayor prevailed with 30%, but if it was down on a one-on-one, then presumably a majority, whatever that number of people would have been, would have dictated who the surviving candidate would have been. I think the problem was created because you had a field of 5, maybe, people, and it was, one election. So consequently, we got the result that we did. So, I mean, if you're gonna consider a modification, it may be to simply mirror a regular general election process with a preliminary and a final, and then, to everyone's point, the prevailing candidate will have at least gotten the majority of those voters who chose to go out and participate, so.
And I agree with you, and I think that's a good idea. I think just like the counterbalance to that is the 2-year term. It's just not enough time. And I think another idea that I've heard is, so this recall happened in March? So the next election is in November. So I feel like there is a time frame in there, but I think that's like
6
for
months, I think.
Yeah, the last 6 months.
So if it's a year, if the person's recalled, they're recalled, the city council president steps in, fills the rest of the term, next in position, the next.
Well, that would be another alternative.
Another alternative to
Right.
that, because I just think the time frame for 2 more
Could be.
elections. And just throw it out there, but I do agree with you, that is a good point.
Okay, well, I happen to think that all of you have raised points that are correct. But I think there's reasonable it's reasonable to have disagreements on this whole process of recall. But nonetheless, we've, I think, exhausted the fact that the resolution only gives us the option. And I do address the option in the next item, so if we can proceed to the next item, that would be good. Enough discussion on the resolution? Yes, okay, so not seeing any other hands, any further conversation, no? Okay, so next steps, and we're gonna put this as under next steps is the proposal that I have submitted to you in the letter dated June 13th. And in that letter, I know that this was last minute, so if you haven't had a chance to read it, I would give everyone a chance to read it, and then I can present a few points about it. So I'll just give you some moments to do that.
The letter was dated June 12th.
Yeah, it's a paperclip as your last item. It's the letter dated June 13th, it's on my stationery. If you finish your letter, just let me know. Give a little nod and I can set. Mrs. Rivera, have you got to the last line yet?
I'm ready.
Okay, so just before.
Processing.
Yeah,
Mr. Chairman.
there's a lot to process, and the good news in processing is that I am not asking that we adopt anything tonight or this afternoon. What I'm asking though is that we forward with these provisions to be kept in mind to Corporation Counsel and City Clerk and me, if you so designate me, and if you wish to designate in addition to me anyone else that might want to join the team, and that we would then come back with a home rule petition draft, which would then come before the task force. The task force would then look at the draft, amend it, change it, dispose of it, do whatever it wants. So here are a couple of things that I offer in preparing this. And I've always kept in mind what is going to be feasible, what is going to be possibly adopted by a council and a mayor. And so I've submitted a few things that I think are relevant to that point. So let me just go over them on the secondary bullets, if you will. One thing that this council and previous councils, and I've not been one that has taken this position, but often the city council refers to itself as someone that wants its own attorney. So I have added as a adjustment to the Cambridge model. Cambridge model, by the way, the city council appoints the city manager, the city auditor, and the city clerk. So I'm suggesting that those three positions be appointed by the council, and that we add corporation counsel. Because no longer would the mayor be a separated chief executive officer, he would be a member of the council, and therefore the corporation counsel, being appointed by the council, would serve the wishes of the corporation, the 9-member corporation, which would be the board of directors, if you will, and the corporation council would serve as corporation counsel for the city of Fall River, and the 9-person council that serves as its board of directors, if you will. As it relates to the recall provision, which is bullet number 2, I'm suggesting that we do make the recall provision a bit more difficult. And that's in keeping with the feedback that I received, that although it was mentioned earlier that it's difficult to get 5% of the voters signing a petition, yes, it would be more difficult to get 10% of the voters to sign a petition. But then my argument is that why should any lesser percentage? In fact, I had one person who said the number of voters signing the petition should be equal to the number of voters who participated in the last city election. But they thought that would be a fairer number, because then that would be overturning the votes of whatever number of thousands of voters who voted in the last previous election by requiring that number to be on a petition to have a recall election. I thought that was a bit extreme. And so I rejected that consideration. But I do think that making it a little bit more difficult by requiring 20 voters to be the initial signatures on the affidavit, which I don't think is a burdensome number, and then requiring 10% of the voters rather than 5% of the voters to initiate a recall. The next bullet relates to the election of the mayor, and I'm proposing, again, one of the most divisive things that happens in city council every 2 years. And again, from my 20 years experience as a city council and previously 4 years as a school committee member, and I've always found that it's divisive for the members to elect their own leadership. In the days of Dan Bogan, when Bogan was elected year after year, tenure after tenure, term after term, there was stability. There was also a very long-term mayor. But of late, it's divisiveness, it's councilors that are, one wants to be president, the other wants to be president, and then sometimes those divisions remain for decades. I know that from my own experience. When I was elected council president, there was division that remains to this day to be divisive amongst the members. And I also think the people want to select their own leadership. And so that's why I'm offering in this particular case that the mayor and deputy mayor serve as a leadership team. It seems to work pretty well when we elect a governor and a lieutenant governor. Seems to work pretty well when we elect a president and a vice president of our country, and a governor and lieutenant governor of our state. So I'm offering a model that would say, let the mayor and deputy mayor choose themselves as a team. So if Councilor A and school committee member B both want to run as mayor and vice deputy mayor, or John Q. Public and Mary Q. Public want to run, whatever two people come together, they collect their signatures together, and we proceed with their election. I'm also mentioning, and this is probably new to some of you, ranked choice voting and proportional representation as the means of electing. It's also in my thought process, what can we do to reduce the cost of governing? If we could eliminate an election by doing what Cambridge does, one single election through proportional representation, which some refer to as automatic primary voting, if you will, because you go through the primary process or preliminary process and the final process all as a part of one vote. And I can go into more details about proportional representation, although I think you may have received some information about that in the Cambridge Charter, of which, by the way, is a 7-page charter versus the 40-some pages of our charter. And then finally, I do see, and I think the final bullet really relates to just the adjustment to Plan E. That currently, the way it governing now is that every charter of every city and every town is a home rule charter. So even though I'm using the Cambridge model as the foundation, I'm suggesting that we not absolutely follow their process, because their process does what I think is divisive. They elect their mayor and deputy mayor from the membership of the council, and then their mayor serves as chairman of the school committee, and then that mayor also gets paid by the school committee, school department, for the portion of responsibility that he or she would have as chairman of their school committee. So he's or she serves as both chair of the council or president of the council and chair of the school committee. It's a lot. It's a significant change. It's one that in my senior years I'm looking forward to not be a part of in the future, only as a voter, because I don't see myself in any way, shape, or form being benefiting or being adversely affected by any of this, because I don't see it going into effect during my tenure as an elected office holder. But I do think it's a dramatic change, and again, my own background is in urban policy analysis, so I'm looking at this largely from an academic and a practical point of view as a political wonk, if you will. And I think that this would be a dramatic change, but I think a change worth going toward, and I think it might be palatable to both the city council and the mayor to let this thing go forward to the State House and then come back to the people who ultimately decide, the people would decide. So I think Ms. Conrad had her hand up first, so Ms. Conrad?
I'm wondering if there's any example anywhere in the state of a mayor and deputy mayor that are elected as a team.
No. As far as I know, no.
Mr. Chairman?
Do you yield?
Yeah, I yield.
I'm sorry.
Mr. Hessler?
Yeah, this is a lot.
Yeah.
This is an awful lot. And as I read through this, I have some of the sections I'm okay with, some of them I'm not. And I'll just be quick. The first one, where you decide that, or we think that it would be a good idea to have the city manager, city clerk, city auditor, and corporation counsel hired by the city council. Yes. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, because if we're gonna hire the city manager, we don't want the city manager hiring the corporation counsel, in my opinion. I think the corporation counsel should be somebody that the city council as a whole has the authority to hire. The second section, with regards to the revision of the recall, I go back to what I said earlier. This part here, you may as well say the recall election's dead at this point. If we were to change it to 10% of the voters, signatures required, my understanding is it was quite a chore for the petitioners at the time to gather the signatures that they gathered. In fact, I think most people thought it was almost virtually impossible.
Didn't
for them
they
to
gather
do it.
6,000 signatures?
They got more.
They have to be registered. They have to be certified, I mean.
I don't know
So-
how many were served, it just needs to meet the threshold. Sorry to cut you
Yeah,
off there.
so they have to be certified, so that means, you really need to get quite a bit of good signatures there. But, that's probably the least of my concerns with these changes.
Just to interject though, just as a point of information, I believe that part of the difficulty in getting the signatures was the question as to whether or not this was a recallable offense, if you will.
Okay.
I think if an offense is so significant that getting 10% of the voters' signatures would be easy if the public in general was so adverse to that person continuing in office that they would sign a petition. I think there was a resistance to resigning by some because they felt that the offense did not equal what a recall provides for.
That's up to the individual's interpretation of what they feel they want in their leadership. But, you know, we all know what led up to this, and in many people's eyes that I would consider to be respectable people in this community, they felt that that was enough. Okay, but that's up for interpretation. But more importantly, we get to the third section with the ranked choice voting, proportional stuff. My goodness, I mean, if we're going to be asking the citizens ultimately to vote for this, and then we're going to be having leadership teams running as a mayor and deputy mayor independent of the city council election, what I see as a problem is the city councilors, let's just say there's a field of 14 and 9 of them are current city councilors, and 2 or 3 of them feel that they want to be in a leadership position. If them running as a ticket with another person who's running for city council effectively takes them out of the city council election, then if they lose that leadership vote, they're out. They're out. And I think you take some good people out of the equation that could be good leaders on the city council by saying to them, well, you want to be a leader, then you got to run for the leadership position. But just so you know, if you lose over there, you're out, because you can't run for the city council and the mayor and deputy mayor at the same time. Or could you?
Yeah, or could you? That's not specified here. This doesn't say that you can't do both.
Okay, so, then perhaps I'm jumping the gun to what needs to be clarified for me to feel better about this, because I happen to think that the leadership of the city council should be someone, in my opinion, who has sat on the city council, not a newbie, not a brand new person. I'm gonna run for mayor, deputy mayor, and nobody else is running for it because they want to make sure they have a seat on the city council. So we got to clear that up. So you end up with somebody that could be the mayor and deputy mayor that doesn't even have city council experience. And the only reason the people on city council experience didn't run is because it wasn't clear as to whether they could. So I think that needs to be cleared up, because I think you'll eliminate some people if you don't. But proportional representation, I understand ranked choice voting, but please help me understand proportional representation.
Okay, as best as I can describe it, and we could spend more time with it, but proportional representation is basically the election of the officials. It is the system that Cambridge uses for all of their elections. And you elect according to your preferred choice. So your first choice gets a number 1, your second choice gets a number 2, third choice gets a number 3.
Isn't that ranked choice?
It's a form of ranked choice, except that with ranked choice voting, you eliminate until you get 50%. One candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. So that's why I specify ranked choice voting for mayor, deputy mayor. So if there are 5 teams, for instance, that are running for mayor, deputy mayor, then the first count might show 40%, 30%, 20%, 10%, 0%. I think that adds up to 100. Nobody gets 50%. So the bottom candidate is dropped from the total. This is the way Cambridge does its voting. No, this is the way ranked choice voting does its voting. So the bottom candidate is dropped.
Yep.
His or her second place choice votes then move up to the candidates that are above. If that first place candidate doesn't get 50%, maybe the second place candidate gets 38% on the second count, and eventually it reaches the point where one candidate is going to get 50% of the vote. That's ranked choice voting. The difference with proportional representation is it is determined with the number, say in this case of 7 councilors. The Board of Elections determines the threshold of when a councilor gets elected. It might be getting 30% of the vote, it might be 35% of the vote, and it's the same kind of system. When a candidate reaches that threshold, he or she is elected to a seat in the council. If on the first count, there's not an election of 7, the bottom candidates is dropped, those second place votes go to the candidates above. If the candidate doesn't reach the threshold, the next one is dropped. It sounds more complicated than it is. It works. It's done through the community of Cambridge. Those of us who went to Cambridge have a little bit better understanding of it. There is literature available, and you can also go to the website of Cambridge City.
Luckily, Cambridge has MIT available to do all the calculating for them and figure out if there's computer error. I just think it gets so complicated that the voters that are reading this to vote whether to accept it or not are going to be confused. I think there'd have to be a lot of groundwork here and a lot of educational information if you think that this whole thing is conceptually as one is going to get accepted. Mm-hmm. And then the last piece, and then I'll yield, is I know the task force was put together to review whether or not we felt that a management style of government would be something that would benefit Fall River. Now we're being asked by the resolution of the city council to look into the recall portion of this, and so now as I look at the document that you're asking us to vote on this evening, or the proposal that you're asking us to vote on, the motion, it brings that into it, which I'm a little uncomfortable with myself. So it's complicating this a little bit. And then the second part of it is, it seems as though, and to your credit, Mr. Chairman, a lot of thought has been put into this, but I don't know that it necessarily reflects my thoughts as much as I'd like it to. And reading that you're suggesting here, or the motion would say that the chair, which I support, Corporation Council, and the city clerk would be charged with kind of finalizing this and then bringing it back.
They would be drafting it. They would not be finalizing
Okay,
it. They would
I'm
be
sorry, drafting it. There'd be so much work done by the three of you at that point, that bringing it back to us, I would be like, oh my goodness, I hate to be a fly in the ointment here, but I don't like 50% of this, and I'm not voting for it.
Mm-hmm.
I think, from my point of view, it seems to be so much here, and so much that I'm not 100% on board with that I'm reluctant to say today, yes, I would adopt this. But at the same time, I do want to see this move to the next step. I want to test the waters. I want to see if there's really an appetite with the city council and the mayor to adopt
Yep.
this.
I just want to know, we are within that 4:30 timeframe. Let me just quickly respond that this would just move it to that one small step forward. I'm very much agreeable to our amending that it be 4 members, not just the 3 of us. If you'd like to be joined, anyone else could join us. I was just trying, for the sake of efficiency and knowing how busy everybody is, that we would still be drafting something that would come back for a vote by us. Ms. Conrad, I know, has a 4:30. I think Ms. Veras
I had a little time.
has a little bit of time. I would still like to see us move this, and I would entertain a motion to that effect if we're ready to do that. I certainly support that.
I make a motion that the Fall River Task Force does accept a draft of a home rule petition.
Okay, so that you would basically move that we forward this
Yes.
for action. Is there a second to that? Okay, we can sit, then it stays in committee, if there's no second. I mean, I certainly would be willing to second it, and I will second it for discussion. So it is made and seconded to discussion, and just on the motion,
So,
Mrs. Viveras?
on the motion, and I think this was alluded to earlier, I think introducing the concept of the proportional representation and the ranked choice voting at the time when we're looking, I thought, to consider whether a city manager form of government was appropriate, I think is complicating it and going to create a problem for us with with voter education. I think the whole idea of ranked choice voting is an issue unto itself, for people to fully understand it and be able to, and I see its merits, but I have to acknowledge, it took me a while to figure out how it would all work. So I think we have to narrow it down to what is our primary objective, number one, and I think introducing those two elements at this juncture with the significance of the text that we're trying to address is going to signal a challenge that won't be overcome. That's my personal opinion. Though I like the concept of ranked choice voting, I don't know that it moves forward at this time with this objective before us. The second thing I would suggest is that the idea of the mayor and deputy mayor running as a team, while this is somewhat what happens at the federal level, because the vice president serves as the Senate and votes in the Senate, I guess, in the event of a tie or there's an issue. But we really don't see them as active voting members of the legislative bodies, and even at the state level. So I appreciate that you can have a good cooperation between, a governor and a lieutenant governor and a president and vice president, but they don't serve primary roles on the legislative bodies. They're primarily executive. So I'm not so sure that this concept is going to serve us as we need it to. I like the idea of the voters electing, should they choose to go with the city manager, that they elect the mayor and vice mayor, that's fine. But I think they need to run independently. I think otherwise you're creating a power, putting two people running as a team with 2 votes each on both of legislative branch, city council, school committee, is creating, you're already starting to create a power connection there that I think, may not be well received. So I would be okay with those 2, but I think they have to run individually. You run as the mayor, you run as the deputy mayor, and it's more likely to create a balance of opinions rather than that, commonality that I think may not serve us well. So that's just my thought. But I like the idea of electing them and having them serve in the leadership roles, because I too have witnessed the negativity that results from the election of president and vice president, on city council, and it never seems as bad on the school committee side, but I agree with you. I think if the voters made that decision, that would eliminate a huge source of animosity that resides or can continue beyond the election, so I'm okay with that. So, and then, the recall, I don't have a strong opinion about that. I think state law may very well should be governing, but I'm not going to feel strongly about that one. But I think that I could support moving this forward, so I'm prepared to suggest an alternative. I could support moving this forward if we decided that the deputy mayor and the mayor would each run for the respective offices and would serve as you so outlined. I'm fine with that. But I think they need to run independent of one another. And I think it should just be a majority vote, absent proportional and ranked choice voting. And I'm okay with the appointment provisions in the city manager provision and the recall provisions.
We're moving, if I may interject with that, I think we're moving close to some agreement. I believe the dramatic change of ranked choice voting and proportional representation would be a good thing. But I'm willing to strike that, and that we go back to the system of preliminary election and final election. I don't like the idea of splitting the chair and the vice chair, because I conceivably could see, and I could see it in our own situation, where you would have 2 people diametrically opposed, where an incumbent chairman or mayor would not want to leave town because the deputy mayor would come in and undo what the mayor did wants to do because they are diametrically opposed to each other. I don't want to use necessarily a current example, but if there were two people that were so adamantly divisive against each other that get elected as mayor and deputy mayor, it would be destructive.
So
Could
to
I
your
ask,
point, how many
in
people-
your departure, that the minutes
Mr.
remain,
Chair?
and I'll just have someone agree to take the final minutes for the next few minutes? Yes, that way we have a continuity.
So how many
Thank
people
you.
are serving on the school committee then? So the deputy mayor and the mayor are 2 out of 9 votes then?
2 out of 9, and on the council, on the school committee, it'd be 2 out of 7, the same as the number that we have here now. But let's entertain the motion, the amendment, because I think that would be necessary. Amend to strike the election of mayor and deputy mayor through ranked choice voting, and the members of the council and school committee through proportional representation, and elect them through the preliminary and final process, the way we do now. Is that moved,
I-
Mrs. Rivers?
I could make that.
Okay.
Motion
Is there a
to
second?
amend.
Second.
Second. So motion made and seconded to amend so that we elect traditionally preliminary and final. I was trying to save to speak to that. I thought that if there was a way we could save $70,000 by having a single election. And I also think one of the good things about proportional representation is that it does result in more diverse members of the council. It just happens that it does. I think the election that we have, preliminary and final, perpetuates what do we have now, 7 members of the council that live in one section of the city, and 5 members of the school committee
Understood.
that live in one section of the city, and that one section of the city tends to get more attention and more benefit than others. I think that this perpetuates that, but if this is a step toward improvement, I'm willing to consider that we go back to the preliminary and final. Actually, a step in the other direction would be to have ward representation, and I've already taken a step away from that by going away from the north, south, east, west, and central representation, and which is also a step away from electing 9 ward councilors. This, I think, goes another step toward maintaining the status quo, which I was hoping we could get away from, but, we can entertain going to preliminary and final as an amendment. Any further discussion on the amendment?
Yeah, I support the amendment in the way it was presented, because I still believe that if we're going to have any success at getting this moved through, we got to keep it as clear and simple as possible. We're going to have a difficult enough time explaining city manager and how that's going to play out to the voters of Fall River versus a mayor. Never mind ranked choice voting and a team running as mayor and deputy mayor. Oh my goodness, I think this thing would be dead on arrival, Mr. Chairman. So I support it, because I think there's always another opportunity, another bite at the apple down the road for ranked choice voting when it becomes more popular in the whole country. So I would support that amendment.
Okay, any further discussion on the amendment to change it and go back to preliminary election, final election? Hearing none, on the amendment? All in favor of the amendment, indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? So voted unanimously to change. Now, on the separation of mayor and deputy mayor not running as a team, just 2 things I wanted to comment on. I know that one of the points that was made by Mr. Hensel that I'd like to comment, that there may be a councilor, maybe somebody elected as mayor that would never have served on the council. Maybe that's a good thing. I think we elected a president that never served in the Congress. And some people felt that that was a good way to go. I think we've had governors. In fact, I think the current governor has never been a legislator. Governor Baker, right? I think
Selectman. I think
he was a selectman,
Yeah,
right?
that was him.
So he had some experience in government, but I think that's where the people choose. The people decide. Do they want someone with legislative experience, or do they want someone without legislative experience? Bring in the broom and clean them out. So I think that's a decision for the voters to make. I don't think that we should restrict that as a committee, that we make it almost a requirement that you need to be a counselor or you need to be a school committee member to be a mayor. So that's one point. And then the other point is that in separating the two and not having them run as a team, I think we run the risk of having divisive government, which I think would be disastrous. So I would not support splitting them. I think it's very good to have two people. And I think part of it too is that it maintains, from the public's point of view, that they're electing leadership that is united leadership, that's going to represent them as chair and vice chair of the school committee, that's also going to be their president and vice president of the council. I think that people would feel comfortable with that rather than electing two people that might be vehemently opposed to each other. That would be, I think, a destructive term of office.
Mr. Chair,
Mr.
for
Heslop.
a point of clarification, didn't we just vote for two things, to eliminate the ranked choice voting, proportional representation, and
No, just those two things, just to
just so
eliminate
that, so your amendment
a
did not
preliminary
include?
and a
I guess
final.
it didn't.
No, your
What did
your
you-
motion was on specifically.
I had talked about that.
She
I
had
had
talked
talked
about
about
it, but that
separating
wasn't
those
part of the
two,
motion.
and then I talked, and the chair, I think, decided to take them separately.
Okay,
So the amendment was just first eliminating the proportional and representational and going back to the preliminary and final.
okay, so I misunderstood. I voted that, I thought your motion was for both.
Yeah, he decided to split them, and I was fine with that. So I was okay with that. So just to go back to your point,
This
I
would
have
be
to
a separate.
say
This
I-
would be a separate motion.
yeah, separate motion, separate amendment.
Amendment.
Okay, so I have to say, you raise an excellent point. I think the leadership does need to be cohesive, and I can appreciate the fact that I can imagine circumstances, without using names, of two individuals who could get elected and because of their authorities, could pose a problem. So I'm a little bit anxious about, again, that block of two that is going to be on the two legislative bodies. But perhaps the benefits outweigh the negatives, because I do think we need a nice, cohesive leadership team. So I'd be willing to support it as is, but I'd like to hear from my other colleagues.
Any further?
How much power do they ultimately wield?
Well, we don't know, because this is a new animal. This would be a new creation. But if I think of it as in the private sector, and your experiences in private sector are as extensive, probably more extensive than mine. If you have a board of directors, a 7-person board of directors in the case of the school committee, or you have a 9-person board of directors in the case of the city council, and you have a chair and a vice chair, or a president and a vice president, who are the leaders of that board,
Yes.
then, and you have then a city manager that requires 5 votes of the council, or 4 votes of a school committee in the case of a superintendent, that leadership will play a significant role in the governing process, which I think is good for the people of our community, that they have direct control over who is that leadership. They also have complete control over the rest of the board, because they're electing the entire board. They're electing the city council, they're electing the school committee, and they're electing the leadership. So I think it really does, for those that might argue that this would be taking away, and I know that's one of the issues in the, when you were a member of the Charter Commission, what can we do to give the people authority? This, to me, gives the people a lot of authority. And even though I have misgivings about the recall, and probably my druthers would be to get rid of the recall, but I think that would be disastrous for a public vote if we took away the people's right to recall. I think the people want that right, they want that duty. I also know from my many conversations on forms of government that are city managers, that recalls are much less common with the city managers, because it's the city manager who's doing the day-to-day management of the city. So they're not gonna really they may get mad at the city manager and maybe even go to the council and say, we gotta get a new city manager, in which case the council by 5 votes can remove the city manager. So I think there are lots of power that, if you will, come with this kind of form, even with the reluctant support that I gave to going to the preliminary and final election, because I think that doesn't provide for the diversity I'm looking for. But I do agree with the point that this is one step, and the next time around, maybe we can go another step to get closer to that proportional representation or ward. I hear a lot of public support for ward councilors and someone coming from that district perspective.
I think one of the biggest conversations that we had in the charter in the charter commission was about ward councilors, and it wasn't supported by the majority of the city in the survey that we handed out. And I think Fall River, population-wise, big city, square mileage-wise, pretty big. I think it's actually a common misconception that the north end of the city is primarily benefited by the diversity of the council. I mean, East Main Street is got a $1.5 million landscape project going on in that area of the city. I mean, there's nothing going on near my house. My street hasn't been paved in 40 years. I could care less, but I'm just saying, I think the way Fall River stands, and this is my stance on it, is the 9 best candidates get the most votes. You want the best candidates. You don't want, and I actually have an extensive research that I did myself on the ward. You could win in your ward and have 103 votes. I don't know if I think I have it in my folder at home. Will Richmond, when he was there, did a very extensive article on if it was ward councilors, who would have won in each ward. And it was pretty telling that you don't want to go down that road. And I understand campaigns would change and different people would run, but from what Will Richmond wrote when he was here, it was something that I wasn't a fan of, and the numbers and the percentages were very, very telling and eye-opening, if you remember that article at all. But also in the recall, the mechanism of recall works. It's a flawed system, that's the issue, and that's the legal language, and that's everything that's happened because it hasn't happened in the state of Massachusetts before. But I think that in the 2 instances of recall, they were very well deserved. And I mean, the only option I heard, during Mr. Flanagan and Mr. Correa's thing, is let them finish their term. It's a 2-year term. That's primarily the biggest qualm of the recall, that I get them in the ballot box in November. And that was the biggest issue I've heard about it. And I think it is pretty difficult to get someone recalled right now. And I think the 2 instances where it's happened have been very, very justified. So, that's just my opinion. And I would say it's succeeding yourself on the ballot after losing the recall is the main target issue. Whether or not that has to be challenged in court or something like that, but that's the crux of the argument. But other than that, with Ms. Viveras' amendment to this, I can support this going the next step and seeing what's going on. But
Very good.
with that, I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. Yes, Mr. Hensel?
Yeah, it's just dawning on me here that this issue with the recall is not an issue. And why do I say that? Because if we're suggesting that the city move to a city manager form of government, then who the heck are we recalling? A city councilor? I doubt very much that you're going to get too many people motivated over one of 9 city councilors to go out and gather even 3,000 signatures to have any councilor removed. When it's the mayor, the chief executive officer, that's a different story. It becomes a moot point in my mind because you have a city manager, and I would trust that the city council, in its responsibility to hire a city manager, would do so with legal counsel guiding them to have a contract that is so ironclad and well thought out that if that city manager did something outrageous, that he or she could be terminated for almost a host of reasons,
Sure.
as opposed to a mayor who's elected, and how do you get that person out of the job? So, to me, I no longer have an issue with the recall. Heck, make it 100%, because it ain't gonna matter. If we move to a city manager form of government, we're not recalling a school committee member. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I don't think you're gonna have the army of people out to go after a school committee or a city councilor. Again, my opinion, I think, so with that said, without even saying more, I support moving this forward.
Yeah, and let me just interject, I concur with you, and maybe my druthers would be that we eliminate the recall provision altogether. But I do believe that from the public's point of view, that they would like to see maintained in the charter the option to have a recall, should that be necessary.
And
Mrs. Viveras?
I'm gonna try to, because I have to leave,
Yeah.
and I wanna be here to vote. So that, I agree completely with Mr. Hetzel's point. So perhaps what we move forward should not even address recall changes. Just leave it the way it currently exists.
With 5%?
It's fine, because again, I don't see
Recall
the
it.
necessity. If they vote to go to, we don't wanna lose the home rule petition vote because people feel that the recall is now unachievable. Leave it alone. You're right, we move to a city manager, the recall is really gonna be far less utilized. I would agree with you.
Okay, so is there a
maybe-
further amendment move to strike
I would- I would-
any addressing of recall?
So my next amendment would be to remove, we're gonna leave the deputy and mayor as you have it outlined and simply amend to remove any change to the recall provisions, so that.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Second. Any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, so be it. So we will strike any reference to recall on this, and now I'm ready to move as amended. Is there a motion to move as amended?
So moved.
Is there a
Second.
Made and seconded. Any further discussion? Move as amended. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, so voted. Thank you very much for that success. I think we have taken a big step forward. Next steps are that we will convene. If anyone would like to join in that discussion, let me know. I'll be happy to schedule a meeting so that any of you, and I'll also relay that to the other members who are not here.
Mr.
Yes,
Chairman,
Mr.
just to be
Hansel.
clear on that, I'm not looking to be involved in more than I already am involved in and have more meetings, especially if the summer approaching.
It all comes back to us.
That's the only point I would make, is that if I'm on a task force and the task force is gonna have its name on that final draft, then I need to know that we're gonna have the opportunity to review it. And please keep us informed as you're going through the process, just so we can, if there's something that's gonna be like so unacceptable to all of us, you know that before you go into a whole bunch of,
Absolutely, I will.
spend a lot of time on something.
I will. Next we have, and I want to get the rest of these done, minutes of May 8th.
Motion to accept.
There were just a couple of typographical errors. I won't go through them, but they didn't change the content of they were just typographical errors. So I would move that I would accept the motion to accept the minutes as amended with corrections.
Second.
Made and seconded by Mrs. Viveras, seconded by Mr. Hetzler. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, so voted on the minutes, and I would entertain, unless there was any other business, no further business, a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn made and seconded by Mrs. Viveras, Mr. Quinn, seconded.
Thank you.
All in favor? Thank you for your attention and your effort.
And I thought I only had to
Thank you,
put two
Mrs.
quarters